extreme heat, Sahara dust, predictions for the hurricane season. It seems as if weather-related warnings are increasing with frequency across the Caribbean. So just how concerned should we be about what we're experiencing? How do we prepare for a year of climate extremes in the region? Well, today we'll be discussing some of the key considerations in this area as it relates to weather across the Caribbean, and hopefully we can answer some of the questions that you might have. I'm Marsha Boyce, and with me is Dr. Cedric Van Meerbeck. He's the resident climatologist at the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, and one of the leading experts in the region as it relates to climate matters. Dr. Van Meerbeck, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Marsha.
So let's jump right into it. Now, following what was essentially a record-breaking 2023, 2024 is shaping up to be another one for the record books in many ways than one across the region. Now, already for this year, we've had intense heat warnings in various Caribbean territories. For example, as early as April and March, Barbados and Grenada having to issue intense heat warnings. Jamaica issuing warnings in May. Temperatures ranging in the realm of 35 degrees Celsius. This isn't really the norm for us. So what exactly is responsible for this?
One of the ways that we can look at what is responsible for the climate that we see on the islands is actually to look at how much heat is in the oceans. The reason for that is that heat out of the ocean has to dissipate some way, some form. So if there's excess heat in the ocean, it will come into the atmosphere at some point. And there are different ways through which physically that happens. One is simply increasing the temperature of the atmosphere. Another way is also a lot of evaporation of the moisture in the water. If you evaporate, that means you turn liquid water into gas, into water vapor. And that takes a lot of energy out of the water and puts it into the atmosphere. So what's happening right now, what's been causing those records, is a combination of factors, but most of them coming on from the record-breaking temperatures in the Atlantic Ocean, particularly in the tropics, and also a very warm tropical Pacific. Now, we're not in the Pacific, so it might be a little bit unconventional to think of heat in the Caribbean with respect to what's happening in the Pacific. But when you have a warm Pacific, that is something that we call an El Nino event. El Nino tends to bring more stable atmosphere conditions. That means it becomes harder for thunderstorms to form. Now you can imagine if there's fewer thunderstorms, there's more sunshine. If there's more sunshine, there's more heat going into the ocean. Bam, it heats up the Caribbean and even further. So the combination of extreme heat, record-breaking heat in the tropical Atlantic, and the El Nino, which is now ending, has really led to the atmosphere being so warm since summer last year and going on this year.
And essentially this isn't really only unique to the Caribbean, but globally, the Earth is heating up. You're seeing estimates of about 1.2 degrees Celsius across the board. How do we make that correlation with what is happening in the region as well?
Correct. That's the way to bring it, to tie it all together. So the global warming, which is nothing but the average temperature of the whole surface of the Earth, that's what we call global warming, has been of about 1.1 to 1.2 degrees so far since the late 1800s. Now, that is a big factor in warming up our climate in general. But when you have on top of that extreme warming, even more so in the Atlantic, you get that extra heat, extra bit of heat in 2023 and 24, which you wouldn't have had in the years, for instance, 2018 or the year 2021, which were cooler. But it's not the first time that you have such a combination. It's just that the climate change, which leads to this global warming, is happening in the background, and that leads to those increases in temperature in general. But on top of that, you have things like El Nino. That means that some years we end up here, and some years we end up here. And so this year and last year, we were right at the top here, far above anything we've measured so far. So it is normal that many of our citizens in the Caribbean have felt so particularly warm for a long time last year and again this year, as you mentioned, starting April. Normally, the heat season in the Caribbean starts in May in the eastern part of the Caribbean and up to a month earlier in the northwest of the Caribbean, like Cuba. But this year, we've clearly already, as you mentioned, seen a heat wave here and there in the southeastern Caribbean towards the end of March. So we're about 1.5 months ahead of where we should be in terms of the occurrence of heat waves. And I can mention right now the first 10 days of May in Barbados have been as hot as the hottest 10 days of last year.
Oh, wow.
So imagine how hot you felt last year. We're already there, and we're not yet in August and September, when on top of the heat that you feel now, the temperatures, you're going to get increased humidity. And you know, when you have higher humidity in the air, the sweat on your skin cannot evaporate fast.
Yes.
And it's that evaporation that cools you down. So the more humid the air is, the less effectively your body can cool. And that's what leads to the heat danger that comes on from these high temperatures and the humidity.
And you mentioned there essentially being a heat season, but when we talk about seasons in the Caribbean, a lot of focus is placed on the hurricane season. Now, if my memory serves me correct, the last time we had such conditions converging, like what you mentioned, would have been around 2010 or so. And that year, we had about 19 storms, about 12 hurricanes, with some of the more prominent ones being, for example, Hurricane Earl or Hurricane Otto. Here in the Lesser Antilles, we went down late in October with Hurricane Tomas, for example, doing significant damage across the region. So when we take all of this into consideration, then what can we expect for the 2024 hurricane season?
So in general, because we have that excess heat in the ocean, that takes months to come out of the ocean. Months to sometimes even more than a year, up to 2 years. Now, it's been already record hot last year. If you remember last year, we had an active end part of the hurricane season. Well, at least the peak of the hurricane season was really, really active. September and October had like an onslaught of storms. So fortunately, last year, most of the Americas were spared from bad damage from the hurricanes because those hurricanes just ended up curving back into the Atlantic. We don't know if this year that will be the same. What we do know is because of that extreme heat in the ocean and because of the fact that a hurricane is the most efficient system in the atmosphere to dissipate that energy out of the ocean, we're not in for a treat. So in terms of hurricane activity, we do forecast an intense hurricane season, again, in terms of the number of named storms, the number of hurricanes, and potentially the number of severe hurricanes or major hurricanes. So that's categories 3, 4, and 5. So we can expect the latest forecast suggest 22 named storms, out of which definitely more than 10 could end up being a hurricane, and a few of those end up being major hurricanes. Now, there is a but there. What we do not know, even though the oceans are the major source of energy, you cannot have a hurricane unless you have some kind of disturbed weather pattern in the atmosphere already. And there are circumstances that we cannot predict yet at the seasonal timescales that would define how many times we're going to have those disturbances being able to form. So one of those reasons is we cannot predict a season in advance how many times we're going to have dust episodes coming from the Sahara.
And I'm glad you mentioned Sahara dust. So what we'll do, we'll take a quick break right here. And when we come back, we'll delve a bit more into Sahara dust and the potential impact it could have on the hurricane season. Welcome back to our discussion on the climate extremes that we are experiencing here in the region and, getting a sense of what exactly we can prepare for. Now, Dr. Van Meerbeck, you are the technical lead for the Caribbean Climate Outlook Forum. And before we went to break, we began discussing the hurricane season and the potential for a relatively active season. But there are a few things that could impact that. And as you mentioned, Sahara dust. So tell us first about the frequency of the Sahara dust that we're seeing in the region. What is at the root of all of this?
What you see that brings a seasonal peak in the occurrence of Sahara dust episodes that intrude into the Caribbean is actually the climate in Africa. When the seasons shift in Africa, you get a shift in winds as well. Now, if that shift in winds reaches into the Sahara at some point towards the summer half year, you're going to see a lot of entrainment of that dust into the atmosphere and then moving with the easterly trade winds to the Caribbean. That is why we get that incoming dust in our region more than, for instance, in Southern America, right? So that's what we see. That is the normal pattern. Now, how does that season evolve for us is that we get our peak frequency of incoming Saharan dust intrusions from about May to July, at least historically speaking. What we have come to notice in the past few years, and that might be related to climate change, we're not sure yet, is that you get earlier occurrences of Saharan dust episodes. And so what we've seen this year, for instance, is that as soon as the month of February, the first episodes came into the region. And that is, of course, leading sometimes to breathing impairment and ocular symptoms with many of our citizens in the Caribbean.
Now, could the presence of this heavy Sahara dust have an impact on, let's say, the formation of hurricanes in our region?
Yeah, it does actually. There are several reasons for that, but I'll just try to simplify. The main reason why this is the case is because a lot of the sunlight actually gets captured by the dust that's higher up in the atmosphere. And what's happening then is that you heat up that higher part of the atmosphere. And the less difference there is between the surface, which typically is hotter, and the higher atmosphere, the more stable the air. So that means you don't get very fast rising air masses, which we call convection, which is kind of the engine behind tropical storm formation. So if you have reduced upward air motion, but instead have more downward air motion, what does it do to us? Well, it decreases the chance of thunderstorm activity and tropical cyclone activity on the one hand. On the other hand, it also traps the moisture in the lower part of the atmosphere. And not just the moisture, but it also traps heat, because as the air tends to descend, tends to go down, it compresses. And the more you compress air, I don't know if you've ever pumped up a tire, but the more you compress air into a tighter space, the more it will heat up. So we get more heat, but at the benefit of less tropical cyclone activity. So there is two sides.
A trade-off, so to speak. I'm sure, those who suffer from respiratory conditions, it's a catch-22 for them. Do I want the increased issues or, the presence of Sahara dust potentially lessening the impact of the development of hurricanes in our regions? As your research team would have mentioned, is essentially two basic scenarios that we're faced with.
Yeah. So one scenario that we're looking at is a scenario that we can confidently forecast, but we cannot neglect what we cannot forecast. So what we cannot forecast, as I mentioned earlier, is how often we're going to get those Saharan dust episodes coming into the Caribbean. If they're not frequent, which is what we can forecast as a standard scenario, you could call it a scenario A or scenario 1, what you're going to end up with is still very hot summertime, a hot heat season. You're also going to get a strong hurricane activity from early on. And you're also going to get increased potential for flooding, flash flooding, etc., caused by extreme rainfall. Now, if you go to the other scenario, which we cannot confidently forecast as yet, our science has not reached that point, is, assume that we're going to get a lot of those dust episodes. What's going to happen instead? We're still going to have a very hot year, but possibly after last year's record heat, breaking the heat records again. And so far, this is what we've observed so far this year. But again, we can't forecast that part into the next few months. So either we're going to be left with a very hot heat season or a record-breaking heat season. In terms of the hurricane season, what is going to happen is the dust frequency tends to decrease as the hurricane season evolves. And so up until August or somewhere about mid to late August, we're going to see an impact of the dust episodes. As long as there are many dust episodes, it's going to stifle the hurricane season activity. And so what we expect is that even though the second half and the peak of the hurricane season might be just as active, whether or not we get a lot of dust right now, the first half might be a little bit of a breather, let's say. I mean, I'm using it in a maybe the wrong way because, of course, it hampers our breathing.
Yes.
But at least we don't need to be as concerned of an onslaught, a constant onslaught of our hurricanes. But let's remember that one hurricane is enough.
Yes.
And between dust episodes, you could always have those conditions that temporarily are well suited for the formation of a hurricane. And then is when we need to remember there's record heat in the ocean, so it can be explosive. And so even though we might have fewer storms during that period, when one storm does develop, it can develop very fast.
So definitely some varying implications there. And we'll take a break here, but when we come back, we'll delve a bit deeper into some of the impacts that these climatic conditions will be having across various sectors in the region. Stay with us. Welcome back as we continue to discuss the climatic changes occurring across the region with Dr. Cedric Van Meerbeck. He's a resident climatologist at the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. Now, Dr. Van Meerbeck, we were discussing some of the health implications, for example, for some of the climatic events we're seeing, the intense heat, as well as, for example, respiratory conditions experienced as a result of Sahara dust and so forth. But there are also several other industries that might be impacted by these climate events, so to speak, with one of them being, agriculture and water resources. With the first portion of the year having essentially gone, what have the reports been like so far?
That's a good question. So if we think about the agricultural sector, one of the first things that we have to keep in mind is that most agricultural workers, farmers and others, they work outside, outdoors. And also for agricultural productivity, both of the animals, the livestock, and the crop growth, we need water and we need the optimal weather conditions. Optimal meaning not too hot, right? So what we have been noticing so far is that there was more dryness, even or a buildup of dryness that was not primarily induced by a reduction in rainfall, because that has been typical for many dry seasons. We're coming out of that dry season now soon. But what has made it different is because it's been so hot, whatever rainfall fell, most of it evaporated faster. And so that means that our ground in many of our territories is very dry, except where there have been intense showers since then. So for the farmers, what is critical now in the coming months is that we are aware that rainfall could increase, but that we need to make sure to capture as much of it as possible, because whether or not we're going to get many wet spells, each wet spells might be very intense, which means there is some potential for capturing a lot of rainfall. But at the same time, whatever falls, it will likely be, in many cases, too much for infiltration into the soil. So that's why harvesting rainwater would be even more important, even though we're going into the wet season in which you will see an increase in frequency of showers. So that's one thing. The other thing is protecting our farmers' livelihoods from the heat. Sometimes that means that the heat is so intense in the afternoon, like in September last year, that farmers just simply can't work in the early afternoon hours. So what would be advisable in those cases on many of those hot days like we're experiencing now, and especially as we build up towards August and September, when on top of that we get the humidity, is to work in very early hours or the later hours of the evening. And so that will help us cope with the heat. Another thing to bear in mind for our farmers' safety is that it is important to have a break from the heat. And that's not just for our farmers, that's especially for the elderly, and that's especially for the children. Now, the elderly are especially vulnerable to heat exposure because they have less sensitivity, skin sensitivity to the heat, but yet their bodies do react to the heat. So they're not aware of it as acutely as an adult. Children are more sensitive because they have more skin surface compared to body volume. And when you have more skin surface, there's more exchange of heat with the outside world. And so they heat up even faster. So it's really critical to protect our outdoor workers, not just the farmers, but also our children and the elderly from the heat, for instance, by allowing them to cool for a couple of hours during the heat of the day. This can be done, for instance, in a supermarket where there's AC, or for those who do have the ways to afford AC in their houses, it is important to cool yourself down for a couple of hours.
And of course, extreme heat and the dryness associated with that also has an impact on areas such as available water resources and things of that nature. But then on the flip side, you have a situation where there's always that consideration of transitioning from the dry season to wet season. Are there any concerns about flooding when that increased rainfall comes into the region?
Yes. So what we haven't seen so far yet is the start of the wet season in the Eastern Caribbean. What typically drives the start of the wet season is when we start getting what we call tropical waves or African waves coming into the region regularly. Since that is not the case, we don't have that atmospheric pattern that leads to rising air masses, which brings up the moisture from the ocean into the atmosphere, cools down higher up, and it can rain. That's why we're not seeing that wet season pattern as yet. In Barbados, for instance, in regular years, we typically on average see that somewhere in June. In Trinidad and Tobago, it tends to be a little bit earlier in the year because it's sort of a little bit further south, and the same goes for Guyana. Guyana, it starts earlier as well. So Guyana has already started its wet season, but we have not. When the wet season comes, remember that whenever the conditions are ripe for these kind of lift of moist air, so that means whenever the tropical waves come or whatever atmospheric pattern allows that, you have the potential for flooding because of the extreme amount of humidity that can be driven into the atmosphere as the ocean is so warm. So we are going to face a year where we need to pay attention to how much rain falls on a particular day. So I would really recommend to follow the Met Services weather forecast on a regular basis, because otherwise you never know what is the day that you're going to have this flooding event.
Definitely, and already we've seen some flooding events in Antigua for the year. But when we come back, we'll be touching a bit more on some of those other areas that might be impacted by some of these climate events. Stay with us. Welcome back to our discussion on the climate extremes that we're facing across the region and talking about some of the implications that these conditions can have for the various sectors. Dr. Van Meerbeck, if we speak about two other key areas in the Caribbean, tourism, of course, and energy, what kind of impacts can we see here?
Yes, so the tourism sector, of course, is critical in our region more than in any region of the world, because it's our number one income driver, at least foreign currency. And so what we do want to do is make sure that our sector is protected as best as it can be. One of the things beyond what we've discussed so far that may impact the tourism sector is coral reef bleaching. when you think about diving operators, when you think about fisher folk as well, but also sports fishing, which is a tourism activity. So besides the heat, besides being prepared for the potential of flooding and hurricane impacts, etc., one of the things that is critical for them is to realize that we need to make our tourists conscious about the temperature affecting the corals, and therefore also drive programs that protect the coral reefs. Now, corals are animals that can survive bleaching once the water is clear enough and clean enough. So keeping our waters clean and clear can also contribute to them surviving a bleaching episode.
And what about then the sargassum seaweed and that encroachment into the region?
So sargassum seaweed is also something that unfortunately has been increasing faster than we hoped for this year. And so we do see that year by year, since 2011, we get a maximum, let's say, of sargassum beaching. So it reaches the coastlines of our islands and continental states towards the summer as well. So the coral reef bleaching will come a little bit later, but the sargassum beaching has already started. And unfortunately, because of the heat that is present in the ocean, plus the Saharan dust providing the nutrients for the algae to grow, and also dryness in the Amazon, which leads to siltation, or basically many particles in the Amazon rivers coming into the Atlantic. All of that forms a perfect mix for sargassum blooms. So yes, sargassum is going to be something that unfortunately we will have to contend with this year as well. Now for energy, the similar consideration is made as in many of our sectors and also in our private homes. We need to cool ourselves down.
Yeah, so consumption then is a major challenge there.
Consumption, not only consumption, there will be an increased demand for cooling. There already is. But on the same side, also for the production, it becomes less efficient to produce electricity when the temperature is higher. So it's important for them to also be able to manage the supply of energy of power to the customers. And it goes beyond that. It goes to also hydropower dams, for instance. If you have this incredible amount of heat, that means more evaporation. That means less through flow of water through the dams if not managed properly. And so that means that there's also reduced potential for hydropower. Now, not every country in the Caribbean is affected by that, but that could be another factor to take into account.
So Dr. Van Meerbeck, then, with all of these implications and all of these scenarios to be considered, how frequently can we look out for information updates? How likely is the situation to change?
So in its role as the Regional Climate Center for the Caribbean, the CIMH produces this kind of information and updates it every single month operationally. So that means you can look forward to the next update at the end of this month and then again at the end of June. And so as the months progress, you can keep yourself updated, which is critical because sometimes things change that were not expected beforehand. We are forecasters, we are not prophets. So that means that we need to update our forecast with the latest information to make sure that you can, as confidently as possible, utilize this sort of information.
And the CIMH updates can be accessed via your website at www.cimh.edu.bb. And of course, you can also find you on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Now, with these updates being monthly, we definitely want to encourage you to follow the requirements, the warnings, the notifications from your relevant national authorities, that being the National Meteorological Services in your respective country, for all of the latest updates relevant to your specific territory. But Dr. Van Meerbeck, thank you so much for joining us as the resident climatologist for the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, and sharing these insights with us here this evening.
My pleasure, Marcia.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcia Boyce.